7:38 p.m., Wednesday, May 5, 1999. A phone rings in a quiet house in Deal, Kent, a small seaside town on the southeast tip of England, the kind of place where the wind smells like salt and everyone knows everyone. A woman picks up. Her name is Debbie Griggs. She's 34 years old, a nurse. A mother of 3 boys, 6, 4, and 18 months old, and she's pregnant with her 4th child. She's calling her sister-in-law, Lisa. It's nothing dramatic, just logistics. Debbie wants to confirm she'll pick Lisa up in the morning for their regular mother and toddler group. They talk. They laugh, probably. They agree on a time. Then Debbie hangs up the phone. She has no idea it's the last conversation of her life. Somewhere in the next 4 hours, inside her own home, with her 3 sons asleep down the hall, Debbie Griggs will be murdered by her husband. It will be 23 years before anyone finds her body. And the man who killed her, the man who tucked his sons into bed that same night, will spend the next 2 decades telling a lie so complete, so patient, so carefully maintained, that even from inside a prison cell, serving a life sentence, he will try to tell it one more time. This is the story of Debbie Griggs. This is what it cost to finally bring her home. Before we talk about how Debbie Griggs died, we need to talk about how she lived, because for 23 years, the only story anyone was allowed to hear about her was a lie invented by her killer. Debbie grew up in Deal. It's a town where families don't move much, where the same last names show up in the same church pews for generations. She was part of a big, tight family, the kind that shows up for each other. That detail matters more than it might seem, because it's her family, not the justice system, who refused for over 2 decades to let Debbie's disappearance become a closed file. She trained as a nurse. She worked in care homes before she became a mother. Caring for people wasn't a role she fell into because she was somebody's wife. It was a profession she chose for herself before any of that. People who knew her described someone warm, loyal, generous. And this word comes up again and again in the court record. Independently minded. Teachers from her eldest son's school testified about her at trial. The judge who eventually sentenced her killer used a phrase that has stuck with everyone who's covered this case since. He said Debbie Griggs was no shrinking violet. She noticed things, she asked questions, she pushed back when something was wrong. Hold on to that detail, because the man who murdered her spent the next 23 years trying to convince the world she was the opposite. Fragile, unstable, a woman who simply couldn't cope and walked away from her own children. The truth is almost the exact reverse of the story he told. Debbie wasn't the kind of woman who disappears quietly. She was the kind of woman who pays attention. Andrew John Griggs was born on the 26th of August, 1962, and grew up in the same town as Debbie. Deal was in his blood in a different way. His family had run a business there for 30 years, Griggs Freezer Center on South Street, a frozen food shop that was as much a part of the town's landscape as the pier. Andrew was also an experienced sailor, a former deep-sea fisherman, someone who knew the Kent coastline the way other people know their own street. From the outside, he looked like exactly what a small town expects a local businessman to look like. Hard-working, capable, a family man. Debbie herself, in writings she left behind, said Andrew was capable of being a good father when he chose to be. That qualifier is doing a lot of work. Because in practice, the court later found, Andrew left almost all of the domestic weight on Debbie. The childcare, the housework, the emotional labor of raising 3 young children, that was hers. Most evenings, Andrew was out, pursuing his own interests, while Debbie held the family together at home. There's a difference between performing fatherhood and being present for it. Andrew had mastered the performance. There was also something Debbie hadn't known before she married him. Before their wedding in 1990, Andrew had gone through a failed business venture, one serious enough that he'd needed treatment from psychiatric nursing services. Debbie apparently only learned about this after they were already married. It was an early, quiet warning sign of something that would define the whole relationship. Andrew controlled information. He decided what people around him were allowed to know, and when. By 1997, the couple had 3 sons, the youngest born that October. Debbie was raising 3 children under the age of 7, working part-time in the family shop and running the household. While, according to an affidavit she prepared, Andrew treated their shared assets as though they were his alone. He restricted her independence. When she pushed back, he told her she was sick and mad in the head. That detail is worth sitting with, because it's not just cruelty, it's a strategy. Debbie had genuinely struggled with postnatal depression after her first 2 children were born. She'd sought help. She'd been treated properly by professionals. She came off antidepressants in March 1995, 4 years before she died, and the court later found she was not clinically depressed again after that. She had done the difficult, responsible thing. She got help, she recovered, she moved forward. And her husband would spend the rest of his life weaponizing that one chapter of her medical history against her. In late summer of 1998, Andrew began a sexual relationship with a teenage girl, a protected witness whose identity remains legally shielded. The court found she was 14 or 15 years old at the time. The judge did not soften the language when he described it later. Andrew had groomed her, exploited her emotional vulnerability, become obsessed with her. Debbie suspected something was wrong. She confronted both Andrew and the girl directly. Both denied it. Andrew didn't stop. According to the judge, he continued the relationship and even flirted with the teenager openly, in front of his pregnant wife, inside their own home. Think about what that means. A woman heavily pregnant, raising 3 small children, watching her husband's attention go somewhere else entirely, and being told by everyone involved that she was imagining it. Then, in February 1999, Debbie told Andrew she was pregnant with their 4th child. His response wasn't joy. It wasn't even neutral. He questioned whether the baby was even his, an accusation the judge later pointed out was not just false, but almost obscene in its hypocrisy, given that Andrew was the one being unfaithful. He told her to get rid of the pregnancy. He went further and suggested their 3rd son might not be his either. Imagine being Debbie in that moment, pregnant, already raising 3 small children, and the man who was supposed to be your partner is telling you your unborn child isn't wanted by him. But here's what matters. Debbie did not fold. She was not passive. She began preparing. The family business required both their signatures on checks, so Debbie took possession of the business checkbooks and held on to them. She told people close to her. This was her ace up her sleeve. She knew, legally, that she was entitled to half of the business. She wasn't simply an unhappy wife making empty threats. She was a woman who understood her rights and was quietly, deliberately protecting her future and her children's future. She was fighting back. She just didn't know she was almost out of time. In the final week of Debbie's life, 2 separate pressures collided. On Tuesday, May 3rd, Andrew drove the teenage girl to Folkestone, a different town, out of sight from Deal, to go swimming. He also called her at home, shortly after she'd gotten back from school. He wasn't being careful anymore. Or maybe he no longer felt like he needed to be. The next day, Wednesday, May 4th, one day before Debbie died, Andrew's parents signed a bank guarantee for a brand new business account, in Andrew's name only. Think about what that means. The joint account, the one that legally required both Debbie's and Andrew's signatures, the one tied to the checkbooks Debbie had been holding on to as her safety net, was quietly being shut down. Her leverage, the thing she believed was protecting her and her children financially, was being made worthless, without her knowledge. Around this time, a business associate named Peter Monks heard Andrew say something that would later become critical trial evidence. Andrew had complained, angrily, that Debbie wanted half of everything, and he'd said, not as a joke, not as an offhand comment made in frustration, that he wished his wife was dead. The judge who later tried the case was unambiguous about what that statement was. Not venting, a genuine expression of what Andrew actually felt. By the evening of Wednesday, May 5th, both threads, The affair and the theft of Debbie's financial security had pulled tight at the exact same time. The judge would later conclude that whatever happened between Debbie and Andrew that night was almost certainly connected to both. Debbie finding out Andrew was still seeing the teenage girl, and Debbie realizing what had just been done to her, financially, behind her back. At 7:38 p.m., Debbie called Lisa, calm, ordinary, making plans for a Thursday morning that would never come. Less than 4 hours later, at 11:20 p.m., Andrew called a friend named Lloyd Dunley, a man he made regular fortnightly trips with to Billingsgate Fish Market, and canceled that night's run. He gave Lloyd a reason. He never mentioned Debbie. The judge, at trial, was certain about what that gap of less than 4 hours meant. Somewhere between 7:38 and 11:20 that night, Debbie Griggs was murdered, inside the home she shared with her husband, in the house where her 3 sons were sleeping, in the place where a mother of 3, pregnant with a 4th child, should have been the safest person in the world. In the early hours of May 6th, neighbors on the street noticed something odd. Debbie's white Peugeot was moving. One neighbor saw it reversing out of the drive around 2 a.m. Another saw it leaving a second time, around 4 a.m. The court later concluded Andrew made 2 separate trips that night. The first, to dispose of Debbie's body, leaving his 3 sleeping children completely alone in the house while he did it. The second, to abandon the car itself. He didn't dump it randomly. He left it on a residential street called The Shrubbery, a road he knew well from his delivery rounds for the family business. Close enough that he could walk home in about 15 minutes, but far enough that it wouldn't be found right away. By morning, Andrew had a story ready. He told people Debbie had walked out after an argument, that she'd said something like, "Let's see how he copes looking after the children alone," and then driven off. He did not call Debbie's parents. Think about that. If your wife has genuinely just walked out after a fight, the first instinct of almost anyone is to call her family, to ask if she's there, to try to reach her. Andrew didn't. The judge later called this one of the most telling details of the entire case. Instead, Andrew's own mother came to the house. So did the teenage girl, and Andrew, on the morning his wife had supposedly abandoned her children, asked the teenager to do his laundry, specifically the black jeans he'd worn the night before. Only after the washing was done did Andrew call the police. When officers arrived, they noted he appeared calm. He told the call handler that Debbie had suffered from postnatal depression, that she had 3 young boys and was pregnant, that she'd become overwhelmed. He said she'd gone missing before and come back on her own. None of that was a mistake. None of it was panic. It was a story, built in advance, using the one real vulnerability Debbie had ever shown, her past depression, the depression she had already recovered from years earlier, and turning it into a weapon against her own memory. Debbie's white Peugeot was found almost a week later, abandoned in the shrubbery, exactly where Andrew had left it. When forensic officers examined the vehicle, they found 2 things that would matter enormously. Not in 1999, but 20 years later. First, the lining of the car's boot had been removed. Not damaged, removed. Almost certainly an attempt to eliminate physical evidence. Second, whoever had removed that lining hadn't been thorough enough. A small smear of Debbie's blood remained on the interior side panel of the boot. It was, as the judge would later describe it, a crucial piece of circumstantial evidence. But in 1999, that wasn't enough. There was no body. There was no confession. Andrew had a consistent story, and he stuck to it without cracking. Kent police could not bring a murder charge on a blood smear and a missing car lining alone. So Debbie Griggs was officially recorded as a missing person, and Andrew, the primary suspect, and now the sole surviving parent, kept raising his 3 sons in Deal. He didn't go into hiding. He didn't act like a man haunted by what he'd done. Over the following years, he eventually remarried. His new partner had 3 children of her own, and the blended family relocated together to Dorset, on the other side of the country, far from anyone in Deal who might have asked uncomfortable questions. He built himself a new identity, The devoted father who'd been abandoned by a troubled wife and who had bravely rebuilt a life for his children afterward. And his 3 sons grew up completely inside that lie. Their mother hadn't been murdered. She'd chosen to leave them. They had no grave, no answers. No way to grieve something they didn't even know had happened. In 2007, 8 years after Debbie disappeared, Andrew successfully applied to have her legally declared dead. He used that declaration to remarry with full legal standing. The lie he told the police on the morning of May 6, 1999, was now permanently written into official public record. Debbie's own mother never accepted any of it. Every year, around the anniversary of her daughter's disappearance, she pushed for media coverage. She made public appeals. She told anyone who would listen that Debbie would never, never have walked away from her children. She died in January 2019, just weeks before police finally charged Andrew Griggs with murder. She came close enough to touch justice. She never got to see it arrive. After a cold case review, Kent police charged Andrew Griggs with murder in 2019. He pleaded not guilty. This was, legally speaking, an extraordinarily difficult case to bring. There was still no body. The entire prosecution had to be built on circumstantial evidence, motive, inconsistency, and the systematic elimination of any other explanation. Prosecutors laid out 2 overlapping motives. First, the financial one. Divorce would have meant Debbie was entitled to half of the family business, the business Andrew's family had run for 30 years. Second, the personal one. Debbie knew about his relationship with a 14-year-old girl, and exposure would have destroyed him. The evidence stacked up piece by piece. The blood in the boot, the missing lining, the inconsistencies in Andrew's own account of that night. His demeanor, too calm, too composed, for a man whose pregnant wife had supposedly vanished. And Peter Monks's testimony about Andrew saying, months earlier, that he wished Debbie was dead. The jury also heard about who Debbie actually was, about the 7:38 p.m. phone call, about a mother making ordinary plans for the next morning, about her devotion to her 3 boys, about the plain human impossibility of the story Andrew had told for 20 years, that a trained nurse, a mother of 3, pregnant with a 4th child, had simply driven off into the night and never once tried to contact her own sons again. On October 28, 2019, the jury reached its verdict, guilty of murder. 2 days later, Andrew Griggs was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 20 years before he could even be considered for parole. The judge cited 2 aggravating factors that pushed the sentence higher: that Debbie had been pregnant at the time of her murder, and that Andrew had concealed her body, leaving her family with no grave and no physical proof for over 2 decades. The judge told Andrew directly that genuine remorse would have meant a guilty plea, and it would have meant telling the court where Debbie was. He offered neither. The judge said he detected no remorse in him whatsoever, and even after conviction, even with a life sentence, Debbie's body still had not been found. 3 years after the conviction, 23 years after the murder. In October 2022, specialist police officers began excavating the back garden of Andrew's former home in St. Leonard's, Dorset, the house where he'd rebuilt his life with his second family. Underneath the concrete base of what had once been a garden lean-to shed, wrapped in blue tarpaulin, they found a barrel-shaped container. Inside were human remains. A post-mortem examination confirmed what everyone had feared and half expected for 2 decades. They belonged to Debbie. And inside that same container, alongside her, were other objects: a pillowcase, a duvet, men's and women's clothing, and the missing lining from the boot of her Peugeot, the exact piece that had vanished from the car in May 1999. Andrew hadn't just removed it to destroy evidence at the time. He had kept it, and then, at some point, he had buried it, with her. He had built a wooden garden shed with a poured concrete foundation directly over the spot. For years, his second family had walked over that ground. He had literally paved over the truth of what he'd done. Here's the part that makes this story almost impossible to sit with. The discovery didn't happen because Andrew finally told the truth. It happened because he tried, one more time, to lie. From inside prison, Andrew contacted one of his own sons, one of the 3 boys who had been asleep in that house the night their mother was murdered, and asked him for something. Not a confession, a request. He asked his son to travel to Dorset, dig up his mother's remains, remove a sample of her hair, travel abroad, and send a letter, pretending to be from Debbie, suggesting she was alive, and that she had chosen to disappear all along. The goal was simple and monstrous: manufacture evidence that could undermine his own murder conviction and get him released. His son did not do it. Instead, that information reached the police. Officers went to the garden in Dorset, and Debbie was finally found. On June 2, 2025, Andrew Griggs stood in court again, this time pleading guilty to perverting the course of justice. The sentencing judge did not mince words. He described Andrew as conniving, devious, and narcissistic. Even faced with a guilty plea, the judge said he could detect no genuine remorse. He called the plot from prison a desperate attempt to escape a murder conviction Andrew had already been found guilty of, years earlier, by a jury of his peers. Andrew received an additional 3 years to be served consecutively to his existing life sentence. His earliest possible release date is now 2041, meaning in total he will have spent more than 4 decades in prison for what he did to Debbie, and what he tried to do afterward. Legally, this case belongs to a small and difficult category, what's sometimes called a no-body murder conviction, a guilty verdict secured without physical remains. These convictions are rare precisely because they demand near-total certainty built from indirect evidence, motive, behavior, timeline, and the elimination of every other possible explanation. The blood smear in the boot of Debbie's car was the closest thing prosecutors had to direct physical evidence in 1999, and again in 2019. Alone, it might not have been enough, but paired with the missing lining, clear evidence someone had deliberately tried to erase forensic traces, it told a coherent, damning story. Someone had known exactly what needed to be cleaned, and hadn't quite managed to clean all of it. When Andrew's legal team challenged the conviction at the Court of Appeal in 2022, they argued that evidence about his relationship with the teenage girl should never have been allowed at trial, that it was too prejudicial. The court disagreed. That evidence wasn't there to make Andrew look bad in a general sense. It explained motive. It explained the state of the marriage. It explained exactly what Debbie knew, and exactly what Andrew stood to lose if she told anyone. The appeal failed. And later that same year, when Debbie's remains were finally found, with the missing boot lining buried right alongside her, the physical evidence simply confirmed what a jury had already been certain of, years earlier, using circumstantial evidence alone. What stands out about Andrew Griggs isn't chaos. It isn't a man losing control in a moment of rage and panicking afterward. It's the opposite. It's sustained control. Sustained, patient deception, held for 23 years without a single meaningful crack. He appeared calm to police on the morning after murdering his pregnant wife. He spent years presenting himself as a devoted, abandoned father. He used the family courts to have Debbie legally declared dead, a formal, deliberate paperwork process, so that he could remarry with a clean legal slate. He built an entirely new life in a different county. That is not the behavior of a man overwhelmed by guilt. That is the behavior of someone who made a decision and then committed to protecting that decision, completely, for as long as it took. Even the scheme from prison, asking his own son to dig up his mother's grave and help fake a letter from beyond it, follows the same internal logic. If Andrew could control the story he believed, he could control the outcome. His only real miscalculation, in the end, was believing that story could hold forever. And there's a particular cruelty in how he used Debbie's own history against her. Her postnatal depression, something she experienced honestly, sought help for, and recovered from years before she died, became his alibi. Her completely justified anger at his affair and his financial betrayal became proof in his telling that she'd simply reached a breaking point and walked away. Taking someone's real human vulnerabilities and turning them into the explanation for their disappearance. That pattern shows up again and again in cases where intimate partner homicide gets disguised as a voluntary disappearance. It's one of the reasons these cases are so hard to prosecute, and so hard for families to survive. This is the part of the story that doesn't end with a verdict. On the night Debbie was murdered, her 3 sons were asleep in that house, 6 years old, 4 years old, 18 months old. When their father drove their mother's body away in the dark, he left them alone in that house, unattended, in the middle of the night. The judge specifically identified this as an aggravating factor in the crime. But the real damage to those boys didn't happen in one night. It happened over the following 23 years. They grew up entirely inside their father's story. Their mother hadn't been taken from them. She had chosen to leave them. That was the belief they carried through childhood, through adolescence, into adulthood. The quiet, corrosive idea that the person who was supposed to love them most in the world had looked at them and decided they weren't reason enough to stay. At the original 2019 sentencing, the judge acknowledged that Andrew's sons had grown into what he called fine young men. But he was equally direct about what that meant for Andrew, in terms of mitigation. Nothing. Because those 20 years of raising them had been built entirely on a lie about their mother's abandonment of them. And then, after all of that, after the trial, after the conviction, after they'd finally learned the truth about what actually happened to their mother, came the letter from prison. One of those same 3 boys, one of the children who had been asleep in that house the night his mother was killed, received a request from his own father. Go dig up her grave. Take something from her remains. Help me pretend she's still alive. He refused. And because he refused, because he chose truth over his father, one more time, when it would have been so much easier to look away, Debbie Griggs was finally found. We will probably never fully know what that cost him. What it means to be the son of both a murderer and his victim in the same house, on the same night, and to carry both of those truths for the rest of your life. Debbie Griggs was not the victim of a single act of violence on a single night in May 1999. She was the victim of something that lasted 23 years. A sustained campaign of erasure, distortion, and false narrative that reached far beyond the moment of her death and shaped the entire lives of the children she had fought so hard to stay alive for. She was 34, a nurse, a mother, a daughter and a sister, from a family that never once stopped looking for her, never once stopped believing her, and never once let her story die quietly. She was pregnant. She was making plans for the next morning when she died. And for 23 years, the man who killed her controlled what the world, and her own sons, were allowed to believe about who she was. The jury convicted him before her body was ever found. When her remains were finally uncovered in 2022, they simply confirmed what 12 strangers had already been certain of, years before, based on nothing but the truth laid out carefully in front of them. And in the end, it was Andrew's own final attempt to hide her, one more time from a prison cell, that led police directly to where she had been all along. Debbie's mother spent the last years of her life demanding this truth be told. She died just weeks before it finally was. This is for her, and for Debbie.